Over 300 years, Russia had more than a dozen czars. Almost none of them died peacefully. The ones who tried to fix the system got killed for it. The ones who brutalized everyone around them got killed anyway. And a few of them died in ways so strange that we're still not sure exactly what happened. This is how Russia's most legendary rulers actually met their end. The story begins with Ivan the Terrible, a ruler who built an empire through fear, and whose own death became a mystery almost as terrifying as his reign. Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV became the first ruler ever crowned Tsar of all Russia. He inherited a fractured collection of rival principalities rather than a united kingdom. He united those rival principalities into an actual empire, pushing the borders east all the way to Siberia. He rewrote the legal code and opened new trade routes. For a while, Moscow looked less like a backwater and more like the capital of something that mattered, and Ivan looked like exactly the ruler it needed. His wife Anastasia died in 1560, and he became convinced she'd been poisoned by the boyars. It curdled into the Oprichnina, his own private police force, loyal to nobody but him, that he turned loose on anyone he decided was against him. Novgorod paid for it worst. Thousands died there in 1570 over nothing more than suspicion. And when he killed his own son 11 years later, it wasn't some sudden loss of temper. It was the same suspicion that had been eating at him for 2 decades, finally landing on the one person closest to him. By his last years, Ivan could barely walk without help. He had to be carried from room to room, his body wrecked by illness and decades of hard living. In March of 1584, he sat down to a game of chess with one of his courtiers and died, on a date some court astrologers had supposedly predicted months earlier. When his tomb was finally opened centuries later, scientists found his remains loaded with mercury. Maybe it was medicine for some chronic illness, maybe it was ritual, or maybe the men standing closest to him, who had every reason to fear what he might do to them next, decided not to wait and see. Whatever killed him, Ivan left behind a broken line of succession. Russia spent the following years tearing itself apart in the chaos historians call the Time of Troubles, a bloody era of civil war, famine, and foreign invasion that finally ended with the rise of the Romanov dynasty. More than a century after Ivan the Terrible's reign came to an end, Peter the Great would emerge to transform Russia into a major European power. Peter the Great was a dynamic and restless Russian ruler who didn't inherit a fully united throne, but rather fought his way onto it as a boy. He initially had to share power with a sickly half-brother while facing a rival, predatory faction of his own family. Unlike some of his predecessors, he was characterized by an absolute inability to slow down and a relentless drive for action. Peter fundamentally transformed Russia and forcefully projected it onto the global stage. His major achievements included building Russia's first real navy entirely from scratch, waging a brutal, successful war against Sweden to secure a crucial stretch of the Baltic coastline, founding a new capital, St. Petersburg, out of swampland by sheer force of will, declaring himself emperor rather than Tsar, explicitly announcing that Russia belonged among Europe's great powers. Peter's punishing schedule, relentless lifestyle, and hard living caught up with his health. He suffered for years from debilitating bladder and urinary tract problems. Furthermore, he failed to secure the political future of his empire by dying before he could clearly establish who would succeed him, leaving behind no capable male heir. Peter died at the age of 52 in January 1725, after becoming fast failing and bedridden, while a popular legend claims his death was accelerated by wading into freezing water in late 1724 to rescue drowning soldiers. Historians are skeptical. The exact medical cause remains unproven. Some blamed kidney stones, while others suspected poison, pointing toward close allies who feared his temper and stood to gain from his absence. Reportedly, he passed away while mid-sentence, attempting to scrawl out his final succession order. Because Peter left no clear male heir, the throne passed to his wife, Catherine I, setting a massive historical precedent that a woman could rule Russia outright. After a series of short-lived rulers and palace coups, a new emperor finally took the throne in 1762. It was Peter III, the grandson of Peter the Great, whose brief reign would set the stage for one of the most dramatic power struggles in Russian history. Peter III. Peter III never really wanted to be Russian. Born a German prince, he ended up on the throne almost by accident. Nephew to an empress who'd plucked him out of Holstein and groomed him for a job he was never especially suited to. Even during his brief 6-month reign, he introduced several important reforms. He freed the nobility from mandatory state service, a bigger deal than it sounds today, and pushed through reforms that briefly made him look like a genuine modernizer. But he's remembered for one catastrophic call. He pulled Russia out of a war it was winning and handed back the territory his own soldiers had bled for, straight to Prussia, a country most of the army despised. He picked fights with the church, he insulted the imperial guard, and in doing so, he handed his wife Catherine every reason and every opening she needed to get rid of him. She took it. In the summer of 1762, Catherine marched on the palace with the guard, the Senate, and the church all lined up behind her. Peter tried to make a run for a naval fortress, hoping the fleet was still loyal. It wasn't. He gave up without a fight and was shipped off to a country estate outside the capital, watched over by the very men who'd just helped depose him. Within days, he was dead. The official explanation was some sudden illness. Practically nobody bought it. European courts were openly rolling their eyes at the story in their private letters. Catherine went on to rule for over 30 years and earned the Great that history stuck onto her name. Peter became a footnote, a cautionary tale about how fast the guard's loyalty can evaporate and how much it can cost you when it does. Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great was originally a minor Prussian princess with absolutely no Romanov blood. She arrived in Russia as a teenager, married a husband, Peter III, who barely tolerated her, and spent nearly 2 decades quietly observing, learning how the empire worked, and letting everyone around her underestimate her until she seized power. Catherine became an empress in her own right, ruling for over 3 decades and transforming Russia into a dominant powerhouse. Her key achievements included expanding Russia's borders all the way to the Black Sea, integrating the empire deeply into European political and intellectual life, corresponding as an equal with the great minds of the Enlightenment, turning St. Petersburg into one of the most dazzling and sophisticated capitals in Europe. Despite her massive public successes, Catherine's private family life fractured. She completely alienated and estranged her son and heir, Paul, keeping him at arm's length from real power for his entire adult life. She seriously considered cutting him out of the succession altogether, but failed to secure an alternative, leaving a deeply resentful future ruler waiting in the wings. Additionally, her incredible legacy was immediately targeted after her death by critics who weaponized her gender to damage her historical reputation. Catherine died at age 67 from a sudden medical emergency after maintaining a punishing work schedule until her final hours. On November 16, 1796, after having her morning coffee and working at her desk, she suffered a massive stroke in her private dressing room. Her staff found her on the floor, barely breathing. She never regained consciousness and died the following day. On the rumor mill, because her death was so suddenly ordinary, jealous critics and enemies immediately invented lurid, completely false legends about how she died to diminish her extraordinary reign, myths that unfortunately persist in popular gossip today. Her passing finally unchained the throne for her deeply resentful, long-suffering son, Paul I, who took the crown with a burning desire to dismantle everything his mother had ever touched. Paul I. Paul I spent most of his life waiting to inherit the Russian throne from his mother, Catherine the Great, who kept him at arm's length from power for as long as she could. He mattered because Russia hadn't had a clean succession in almost a century. Since Peter the Great died without naming an heir, the throne had passed through wives, infants, and palace coups, and Paul, once he finally took the throne in 1796, moved fast to make sure that would never happen again. He passed a law fixing succession to the eldest son, a genuine attempt to end the chaos that had plagued Russia for 100 years, and one of the few reforms from his reign that actually lasted. Everything else unraveled with remarkable speed. Paul ruled with an obsession for discipline and control that quickly alienated nearly every powerful group in Russia. He flooded the court with arbitrary regulations, including banning round hats and the waltz, because he associated them with French revolutionary ideas. He even outlawed the word citizen and imposed a strict nightly curfew enforced by police who stopped carriages to clear the streets. His unpredictable behavior extended to politics as well. He abruptly reversed Russia's foreign policy, punished loyal officers over trivial mistakes, and ruled through fear rather than trust, convincing many nobles and military leaders that he had become dangerously unstable. In March of 1801, a group of officers he'd personally humiliated broke into the palace in the dead of night and confronted him, demanding he abdicate on the spot. He refused. What happened next was quick and brutal, and by morning, the official line was a sudden stroke, a story almost nobody believed. It mattered because the one Tsar, obsessed with ending Russia's cycle of chaotic successions, got taken out in exactly that kind of coup, just 5 years after fixing the law. His son Alexander I took the crown within hours, and had almost certainly known a coup was coming, even if he hadn't signed off on exactly how it would end. One more proof that in Russia, not even your own children were guaranteed to protect you. Alexander I inherited the Russian throne after the assassination of his father, Paul I, and later became the ruler who defeated Napoleon and helped reshape Europe. He mattered because he beat the man nobody else in Europe could beat. His campaigns against Napoleon reshaped the balance of power across the continent, and by the time the wars ended, he was one of the most celebrated rulers Russia had ever produced, credited with saving Europe from French domination. What went wrong was that the man who won the war couldn't make peace with himself. After 1812, he fell under the influence of a religious mystic and became convinced Napoleon's defeat had been an act of divine judgment rather than his own doing. By the 1820s, he was talking openly about walking away from the throne entirely. Underneath it, more than a few historians suspect the real weight on him was guilt. He'd known about the plot to depose his father and did nothing to stop it, and spent the rest of his reign somewhere between penance and dread. In 1825, traveling through southern Russia, he reportedly fell ill and died suddenly, far from Moscow and far from any doctor whose word people would fully trust. There was never an autopsy that satisfied everyone, and the rumors started almost immediately. The one that stuck around the longest claims he never died at all, that he staged the whole thing and disappeared into Siberia, living out the rest of his life as a wandering hermit named Fyodor Kuzmich. It's the kind of story that should have died out generations ago, and somehow never quite has. It mattered because whether he died or simply walked away, Alexander's sudden absence threw the succession into immediate, catastrophic confusion, forcing his military-minded younger brother, Nicholas I, to inherit a crown under the immediate gunfire of a rebel uprising. Nicholas I was never supposed to be Tsar. He was the third son, shipped off young into a military education, while his older brothers were groomed for the throne he wasn't in line for, until one of them died suddenly and the other quietly gave up his claim, leaving the crown to land on Nicholas almost by default in 1825. He mattered because he decided, on day one, exactly what kind of ruler he was going to be. His own coronation was nearly derailed by an uprising of reform-minded officers demanding a constitution, and he crushed it without hesitation. That single moment set the tone for the next 30 years. Total control, total order, zero tolerance for dissent. He built out the secret police, censored the press, and ran the empire like a barracks. Under his watch, Russia also became the undisputed muscle of Europe, feared and respected in equal measure, a superpower with an emperor who saw himself as the last line of defense against chaos. What went wrong was that the image outran the substance. Nicholas had spent decades polishing Russia's reputation as an unstoppable military machine, but underneath it, the empire was still riddled with corruption, short on railways, and years behind Western Europe industrially. When he picked a fight with the Ottomans and dragged in Britain and France, the Crimean War exposed all of it at once. Russian troops were outgunned, undersupplied, and beaten badly at the siege of Sevastopol. The invincible empire he'd spent his whole reign building turned out to be hollow at the core. He died in March of 1855, while the war was still grinding on, officially of pneumonia, after catching a chill reviewing troops bound for the front. He'd refused proper treatment in his final days, and the timing was suspicious enough that rumors of a slow, deliberate suicide followed him to the grave, a man choosing to let the illness finish what the war had started on his conscience. It mattered because he left Russia in the middle of a losing war and handed the mess straight to his son. Alexander II inherited a humiliated empire, forced to sign a peace deal on ugly terms just months later, and the shock of that defeat became the spark for the sweeping reforms that would define his reign, including the eventual end of serfdom itself. Alexander II ruled Russia during one of the empire's most important periods of reform, inheriting a country still built on serfdom and badly in need of modernizing. Known as the Tsar Liberator, he earned that name in full. He abolished serfdom and pushed through the most sweeping reforms the empire had seen in generations, modernized courts, expanded education, and a taste of freedom for millions of people who'd never had any. For the radicals plotting against him, none of it was nearly enough. A revolutionary cell, calling itself the People's Will, decided the Tsar himself had to die, and they made it their entire reason for existing. He survived several assassination attempts over the years, including attacks on his train and even inside the Winter Palace. His luck finally ran out in March 1881, when a bomb exploded beside his carriage in St. Petersburg. He stepped out to check on the wounded, and a second attacker fatally wounded him. Rather than securing the dynasty, Alexander II's assassination fueled even greater radicalism. His son, Alexander III, responded with a sweeping crackdown on revolutionary movements, tightening censorship, expanding the secret police, and reinforcing absolute autocratic rule. The unrest was suppressed for a time, but its underlying causes remained unresolved. When Alexander III died in 1894, the throne passed to his son, Nicholas II, an inexperienced ruler who would ultimately face the revolutionary storm that brought the Romanov Empire to its end. Nicholas II, then history stopped cooperating. A humiliating war with Japan, a failed revolution in 1905, and finally the slow-motion catastrophe of the First World War chipped away at whatever authority he had left. By 1917, the capital was starving and exhausted, and the streets had turned against him for good. He abdicated within weeks, quietly closing out 3 centuries of Romanov rule. In July 1918, as anti-Bolshevik forces closed in on Yekaterinburg, local revolutionary leaders decided against the risk of the family being rescued. Nicholas, his wife, their 5 children, and a handful of loyal servants were executed by Bolshevik authorities in the guarded house where they'd been held. It mattered because there was no going back after this one. Every Tsar before him had died into a system built to survive him. A son, a wife, a brother, waiting to pick up the crown. Nicholas's death didn't just end a reign, it ended the entire institution. The Soviet government sat on the full truth for decades, and it wasn't until DNA testing in the 1990s that the family's remains were finally confirmed, closing out a mystery that had lingered for most of the 20th century. 300 years of Romanov rule, and the final chapter wasn't a coronation or a succession, it was a basement. From a chessboard in the Kremlin to a basement in Yekaterinburg, the Russian throne was never really a safe place to sit. Reformers got killed just as often as tyrants did. Guards who were supposed to protect the crown turned into the ones who ended it. Even the Tsars who saved their empire couldn't always manage to save themselves. Want to know which one came closest to escaping that fate? That's the next video.